Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for a very exciting program today, which kicks off Global Ties Arizona's Asia Forum in October. The Asia Forum is a series of events that we're hosting this month, both virtually, hybrid, and in person, to foster Arizonans' greater understanding of Asian cultures, traditions, history, and current events. And we are thrilled today to host Peter Martin, author and defense policy and intelligence reporter for Bloomberg, sharing with us today his new book, China's Civilian Army, The Making of Wolf Warrior Diplomacy. I would like to extend a special thanks to our Asia Forum chair and vice chair of our board of directors, Richard Fincher, as well as to our moderator of today's program, Nicole Magny, also a Global Ties Arizona board member, for their efforts to make these events possible. I am Kristen Allen. I am the executive director here at Global Ties Arizona, based in Phoenix. Global Ties is a registered 501c3, and we are the local implementer for the U.S. Department of State's International Visitor Leadership Program, which brings emerging leaders from around the world to Arizona to interact with our local leaders of government, business, educational institutions, and nonprofit organizations, as well as with the citizens of our local communities in order to support U.S. diplomacy efforts with countries around the world. We are also a member council of the World Affairs Councils of America, bringing the world to our local classrooms, businesses, and community through speaker and other educational programs. So please visit our website at globaltiesarizona.org to see our other upcoming events and more information on ways that you can get involved. You may have noticed by now that our event is taking place in a Zoom meeting format. This said, I kindly ask that you keep your microphones muted just until we reach the question and answer section of the program today. This program is also being recorded and will be available for later viewing on our website and YouTube page. Please feel free then to turn on or off your camera as you are most comfortable. And we are reserving about 25 to 30 minutes today for question and answer. So you can feel free to submit those questions via the chat function or raise your hand using the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen when it comes time. You can also directly message myself or our moderator today, Nicole Magny, should you wish to submit a question privately. So before we get started with today's program, I am delighted to welcome and introduce our chairperson of the board of directors of Global Ties Arizona, Dan Schweiker, for some opening words. Over to you, Dan.
Well, thank you, Kristen. And on behalf of the board and staff of Global Ties Arizona and the World Affairs Council of Arizona, we welcome you for what we think is going to be just a wonderful presentation about Peter's new book. And we encourage you to think of great questions, send those in, ask them. We will have a lot more programs over the next year like this. So we encourage you to watch our website and join us. And Peter, we're thrilled that you're taking time out of your busy day job with Bloomberg to take the time to address us today. So again, on behalf of the board and staff, thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. Great to have you. And now I would like to kick it over to Nicole Magny. I'm pleased to introduce and welcome Nicole to our virtual stage. She is our moderator for today's event and is going to be introducing our very special guest, Peter Martin. Nicole is a technology analyst for Second Front Systems. In this role, Nicole researches emerging commercial technologies and analyzes their utility for the U.S. national security sector. Before moving to Arizona in 2019, Nicole had worked at the Pentagon as a speechwriter to Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, where she frequently traveled to and engaged with other nations such as India, Oman, and the Czech Republic. She holds a bachelor's degree in history and Arabic from Vassar College, a master's in security studies from Georgetown, and has lived abroad in Jordan, Scotland, Belgium, and China. So pleased to have you today, Nicole. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. And thanks, Peter, for making the time to hop on with us today and discuss this fantastic book. It was a really excellent read, so I'm looking forward to hearing you talk about it more and then engaging in some Q&A. Before we dive into that, though, let me just introduce you a little bit more. I know Kristen mentioned that you are Bloomberg's defense policy and intelligence reporter in Washington, D.C. Peter is previously based in Beijing, where he wrote extensively on the escalating tensions in the US-China relationship, and has reported from China's border with North Korea and its far western region of Xinjiang. His writing has been published by many outlets, including Foreign Affairs, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, The National Interest, and The Guardian. And he holds degrees from the University of Oxford, Peking University, and the London School of Economics. So Peter, we're thrilled to have you. I'll turn it over to you. Before I do that, let me just mention quickly, though, that we will be giving away a signed book at the end of the program. So stay tuned for that at the end. Kristen will be announcing the winner of that at the end. So let me turn it over to you, Peter, to hear more about your book.
Thank you for such a wonderful and warm welcome. I'm excited to do this, and I'm going to try my best to keep my remarks brief so that we've got lots of time for back and forth and Q&A later on. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about how I came to write the book, and then kind of go into some of the key findings after that. And I guess kind of, the starting point for this really came in early 2017 when I moved back to Beijing after having been away for a few years. And, it was clear just, watching the Chinese government that it had made these extraordinary steps forward in terms of its economic development. The Chinese economy at the time was beating analysts' expectations, and Xi Jinping was rolling out the Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative around the world, and from looking at the Chinese military, which was on the cusp of opening its first overseas base in Djibouti in Africa, and was busy militarizing islands in the South China Sea. So both from an economic perspective and a military perspective, the country had made these incredible strides forward. And at the same time, I think that there was a widespread feeling, both in Beijing and across the world, that the Trump administration was creating additional opportunities for China. As the administration was taking issue with US allies, it was criticizing multilateral organizations, and I think a lot of people in China felt like there was kind of a void there for the country to step into. But what became clear the longer I was based there and the more I sort of reflected on it was that the country wasn't succeeding in stepping into that void. And so I started to wonder why that was, and why was it that this country, which had such extraordinary economic and military might at its fingertips, struggled so much with the power to persuade others. And kind of in that context, I started to think of Chinese diplomats really as a microcosm of that broader problem that Beijing has when it comes to engaging the world. And when you meet them, or if you talk to people who have worked in the State Department or the British Foreign Office, you realize very quickly that these are sophisticated, highly intelligent people who have graduated from the best universities out there, Georgetown and other places like that. They speak multiple foreign languages, and they're really every bit as sophisticated as their counterparts overseas. But when they sit down at the table to discuss international affairs, they suddenly become very stilted in the way that they express themselves, there's this kind of real sort of disconnect there. So I decided that Chinese diplomats would be kind of a good topic for a book study on why it was that the PRC kind of struggled to communicate. And when I started out, this was a relatively niche topic. It wasn't something that people were covering in great detail. But as the years wore on, people started to use this phrase "wolf warrior" to describe Chinese diplomats, and that started to kind of really give a focus to what I was doing. So, you know, Chinese diplomats were storming out of meetings. They were insulting their foreign counterparts, and it was really quite a spectacle to watch. But I guess one of the things that really jumps out to you when you research the topic is that while this idea of wolf warrior diplomacy seems very new on the surface, its roots actually go back a long way. So when the People's Republic of China was founded by Chairman Mao in 1949, China basically had no diplomats to speak of. It had kicked out all of the previous generation of diplomats who worked for the nationalist government before, because it believed that they were too ideologically impure to serve the new government. And it faced kind of this paradoxical challenge. On the one hand, it desperately wanted to communicate with the outside world and to build ties. But on the other hand, it was obsessed with secrecy and deeply paranoid. And so the way that China's first foreign minister, Zhou Enlai, dealt with that challenge was that he came up with this idea that Chinese diplomats would think and act like the People's Liberation Army in civilian clothing, that they would kind of base their whole ethos around the idea of how the Chinese military acted. And what he meant by that was that the Chinese diplomatic corps would be disciplined to a fault, that they would be, and that they would display this fighting spirit when they interacted with the outside world. And that kind of set of founding principles manifested itself in a group of incredibly distinctive behaviors, which started out in 1949 and have really lasted through till today. So Chinese diplomats will typically stick closely to talking points, even if they don't resonate with the people across the table. They will move around in pairs to keep tabs on each other. On occasion, they'll shout at foreign counterparts if they feel cornered, or they worry that they won't look tough enough to audiences back home. And they'll take even the smallest slights and kind of elevate them into these major international incidents. And you know, we've all seen plenty of examples of that in recent years. But in fact, we saw these kinds of wolf warrior displays right from the very beginning. So in 1950, a Chinese diplomat named Wu Xiuquan, who was this kind of veteran revolutionary leader. The guy had a bullet scar on his cheek. He led a delegation to the United Nations in New York and delivered this speech, which, you know, frankly makes today's wolf warrior diplomats look like a bunch of wimps. And Time magazine actually described it at the time as 2 awful hours of rasping vituperation, which kind of gives you some idea of what it was like to be in the room with him, I think. And, you know, in the decades after that, Chinese diplomats wielded axes on the streets of London. They engaged in literal fistfights with opponents of China, and you know, kind of took on this extremely aggressive image around the world. But at the same time, there was this kind of alternate tradition in Chinese diplomacy, which aimed much more at charming the world and persuading others of China's intentions. And we saw that tendency manifested in the 1950s when Zhou Enlai took the diplomatic corps to the Bandung Conference and really did an exceptionally impressive job of winning over opinion in the developing world. We also saw it manifested in the 1990s, in the aftermath of the Tiananmen massacre, when China's Foreign Minister Chen Qichen softened China's talking points, massaged them to make them resonate more with Asian nations. The country set aside territorial disputes and embarked on a this sort of 2-decade charm offensive, which ultimately culminated in China hosting the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics. So I kind of think of China as having these two tendencies which cycle back and forth. One tendency, which is to aim to charm the world, and the other, which is really an effort to tell the world what to do and to tell it off using wolf warrior tactics. And so what we've seen really quite dramatically, I think, since around 2008 is quite a decisive turn back toward that kind of assertiveness we saw in the earliest days of the PRC. And I think it's been driven by a couple of things. So on the one hand, there is this new confidence on the part of China's leaders and Chinese diplomats. And on the other hand, there are these enduring insecurities, some of which I mentioned before, and some of which have kind of emerged in recent years. I think when it comes to the new confidence, you have to think about how China weathered the 2008-9 global financial crisis, as Western policymakers appeared uncertain about the best approach to take. China's leaders launched a massive stimulus package, which was widely hailed around the world as helping to save the global economy. And there were all kinds of problems with that package, of course, but at the time, it kind of set this new narrative about a China model and Chinese success. At the same time, Beijing had successfully held the 2008 Summer Olympic Games. It was being, recognized around the world as a leader as it never had been before. At the same time, there was this kind of tendency towards fear and insecurity in the Chinese system. And that tendency became especially apparent after Xi Jinping became China's leader in 2012. So Xi launched a sweeping anti-corruption campaign across China, which saw 1.5 million officials punished. He abolished presidential term limits. He began experimenting with re-education camps in the far west of China. And he really focused on ideology at home and emphasized the threats that foreigners might pose to continued Communist Party rule. And when Chinese diplomats saw these signals, they were quite clear about how to interpret them. So, in the past, they had experienced multiple rounds of purges in which Chinese diplomats informed on each other. In the Cultural Revolution, they'd seen Chinese ambassadors locked in cellars and forced to clean toilets and beaten by their own subordinates until in some cases, Chinese ambassadors coughed up blood. Large numbers of Chinese diplomats were themselves sent off to re-education camps. And so, they're acutely aware of how high the stakes can be. And what happened, I think, was that Xi began to set a new tone for Chinese diplomacy and talk about how he expected China to stand closer to the center of the world stage, to never accept foreign bullying, and all of these themes that we now associate with his leadership. And Chinese diplomats began to kind of mimic that tone as a way to stay safe and a way to advance their own careers. And we saw that process kind of go into high gear during the coronavirus outbreak. So on the one hand, once again, Chinese diplomats felt relatively confident about their own model. They watched as the United States and countries in Europe struggled to contain the pandemic, and compared that to their own response, which they, in which they felt relatively confident despite events during the very earliest months of the outbreak. They also faced, though, this cacophony of international criticism of China's policies, to which they felt compelled to give an answer, and they did so by lashing out. So we saw them picking Twitter fights with foreign leaders. We saw them in some cases spreading conspiracy theories about the origins of the virus, and displaying that kind of fighting spirit that Xi Jinping had expected to see right from the outset. One diplomat in particular, Zhao Lijin, who is now spokesman for China's foreign ministry, kind of became the poster child of that new approach, and of course was kind of took the lead in spreading that coronavirus conspiracy theory. It's important, I think, to emphasize that not all Chinese diplomats like this new approach. There are people who have devoted their careers to improving China's image in the world, to building friendships overseas, who are quite disturbed by this turn of events. But at the moment, they don't feel really empowered to speak out, and I think that's in large part due to the nature of the changes which Xi Jinping has introduced. And so with that, why don't we open it up to questions? And I'd love to hear from you, your perspectives.
Great, thank you, Peter. Everyone else on the line, please feel free to submit your questions in the chat, or raise your hand via the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen, and I'll go ahead and call on you to come off mute and pose your question. But I'll kick things off with a couple of my own. So I'm not exactly sure the origin of this phrase, but I've heard it in several China-related discussions over the last couple of years, that America thinks in terms of decades or maybe even presidential terms, and China thinks in terms of centuries. And I was just wondering if, based on your research for this book, would you agree with that assessment, and how does that kind of impact the US and China's ability to work together toward shared diplomatic ends?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's it's one of these themes that comes up again and again when people talk about Chinese foreign policy. And I guess there are kind of two camps when it comes to thinking about this. Henry Kissinger has been an incredibly well-known proponent of this idea that China thinks in decades, and there are others who tend to think that China takes a more short-term practical view. I think there are kind of merits to both approaches, but my main source base for this book was the memoirs of Chinese diplomats, and it becomes quite clear when you look at those texts that a lot of the time, Beijing's envoys are very, very focused on the here and now, and overcoming this whatever short-term crisis has been put in front of them. Oftentimes, those crises to us would seem relatively trivial, but again, to them, these things seem extremely pressing and really outsized. And so that's tended to put me a little bit in the kind of camp that thinks that they tend towards short-termism, at least when it comes to implementing the details. But as anyone who looks at China's economic policies will know, it's certainly also true that the policymakers in Beijing are capable of taking a long-term objective and pursuing it with great rigor. So I wouldn't want to be one to underestimate that.
Got it. Thank you. I see Richard has his hand up, so I'm going to ping pong it over to him for his question.
Here, the question concerns Taiwan. And we all know what's happened in the last few weeks with dozens of military aircraft flying into airspace. So according to my read of history, China has always tried to make Taiwan a minor issue historically, and now it's not. So what's your take as to the government's view of Taiwan and the urgency to reunify the country, however you want to phrase it? Thank you.
Yeah, again, such an important question and something that's really been very prominent in the news recently, and very much on the minds of policymakers in Washington. You know, I think it's really hard to get your head around just how important Taiwan is to policymakers in Beijing. You know, it's this relatively small island, which, you know, frankly, a lot of the time, people will, you know, I remember the first time I traveled there, someone said to me, "Oh, great, you know, I went to Thailand. That was a lot of fun." They'll kind of confuse it with other places in the region, but for Chinese leaders, Taiwan kind of looms over everything. And so one of the passages in one of the memoirs that I looked at featured former Foreign Minister Li Jiaoxian, who said that, you know, China is unlike any other major power in the world because it has never realized the unification of its territory. And so there's this sense, I think, in China that until Taiwan, in their view, comes back to the mainland, China will be kind of an incomplete great power. And you're absolutely right that in the past, China's leaders have sort of decided to focus more on economic development and winning friendships, and have kind of tried to ensure that like the Taiwan question doesn't loom over everything and distract from those kind of long-term goals. But actually, if you look, even in the 90s, when China was busy pursuing friendship diplomacy with countries around the world, when it was challenged on Taiwan, the response would be, you know, incredibly strong, up to and including kind of military maneuvers and the kind of things that led to the 1995-6 Taiwan Straits crisis. What's happened in recent years, I think, is that Xi Jinping has decided that this is maybe his objectives are the same as his predecessors, but his timeline is a little bit shorter. And so outsiders have kind of been left guessing, does he plan an invasion? Does he you know, want to take steps to forcefully unify the two territories? And in truth, I don't think we have a definitive answer to that. The military maneuvers in the Strait over the last week have clearly rattled people, and I think quite deliberately on China's part. But Xi at the same time gave a speech where he repeated China's hope that Taiwan would return to the fold peacefully, and that's certainly the message that's certainly what many people still feel like he'd like to do. So I guess the answer is that we don't really have a definitive answer on that yet, but it's something that's certainly front of mind.
So before I hand it over to Kevin Hernandez to hop off mute and ask his question from the chat, I did just want to ask one that may be helpful for framing for folks on the line who maybe aren't as familiar with China, haven't done a lot of research into it, or haven't been there. How important is our relationship with China at the local level? Because Global Ties Arizona is really focused on cultural exchange and more of that public diplomacy, people-to-people diplomacy element. And so I'm just curious kind of how, if you could tell us a little bit about how China views public diplomacy and how that may differ from how the US views it, and then also just sort of putting the local level into context for folks on the line.
Yeah, so it's something that China says it believes is very, very important. And certainly, I think when Beijing looks at a country like the United States and tries to assess where its closest potential friends might be, it looks at Washington and thinks, you know, there's opposition here everywhere from Capitol Hill to the Pentagon to K Street and beyond. And it kind of looks at state level governments and local governments and thinks, well, you know, these people aren't as concerned with national security as elites in Washington, and they seem to be really focused on attracting investment and growing their economies. And so maybe we have a great deal in common, and maybe we can build up ties on that basis. And to some extent, it's been quite successful at doing that. I think the problem now, though, is that Beijing's economic overtures are themselves seen as quite threatening across the United States. And so I think, you know, some of the potency of that message has kind of been diluted. There's the additional problem, I think, for Beijing that Chinese officials are given so little leeway in the way that they make their case to the world that local representatives often sound like they're just parroting lines from the center, and they're not really, you know, capable of engaging in a meaningful dialogue in the way that would be necessary to make those ties most useful.
Thank you. Kevin, do you want to hop off mute and ask your question that you put in the chat?
Thank you, Peter. My question is, are there any important personalities in China that potentially might resist foreign diplomacy? Maybe Li Keqiang, for example?
Yeah, Kevin, it's an excellent question. You know, I kind of think of wolf warrior diplomacy as stemming from, you know, two sets of things. On the one hand, there's the set of policies that Xi Jinping has put forward, and on the other hand, there's this kind of general mood in China based on, as I said, the new confidence and the enduring insecurities that has made wolf warrior diplomacy possible. So, you know, those two things together have created quite a broad-based consensus in favor of more assertiveness in Chinese foreign policy. You know, when it comes to top leaders like Li Keqiang and others close to Xi Jinping, it's very hard to discern whether their views differ from his and how far. But so far, I think that there's very little indication on that level. Kind of further down the pecking order, inside the foreign ministry and among Chinese scholars who focus on foreign policy, there are, you know, I think it is clear that there are people who disagree and who believe that China's approach has become counterproductive in recent years. But I think the thing to remember is that this is not a political climate at the moment in China, which is conducive to people being able to kind of speak out and take issue with the central government. And so even where there is opposition to the approach that China's taken, it's very, very hard for those people to make their case. And it's even harder to imagine them actually you know, affecting meaningful policy change.
You know, one of the themes that I took away from the book that seemed to be a common thread throughout the history of the diplomatic corps in China is this cult of personality. and how kind of essential that was to the initial creation of the diplomatic corps, and how that thread has kind of been pulled through under different personalities. So it's interesting to hear a little bit more about that. So I'll turn it now to Adrienne, who works in the global food and agriculture industry, and she threw in a very interesting question in the chat. So Adrienne, if you want to come off mute and ask that.
Sure. Thanks so much, Nicole. Hi, Peter. Thanks for joining us. This is a really interesting discussion. As Nicole mentioned, I work for a Fortune 500 CPG company, and we do source product out of China. There are major concerns, and frankly, the issues that we face are that consumers don't want product from China because of concerns over how China responds to environmental policy, particularly around climate change, GHG emissions, and more recently, we've actually seen the entire global industry push back on some of the forced labor issues, particularly prison labor in the Xinjiang province. And so we actually are not permitted to source raw material from there. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about China's, stance on responding to ongoing concerns around human rights and environmental policy, and if you foresee any changes in how they're addressing this.
It's such a pressing question, and it's kind of a difficult one to answer, because I think that the people who are driving policy in places like Xinjiang tend not to be the ones who are charged with defending those policies to the world. So, I remember when I was a reporter in Beijing, attending foreign ministry briefings when allegations about re-education camps first surfaced. And it was remarkable to kind of watch foreign ministry spokespeople, because in those very early weeks, the go-to response was that these allegations are lies and conspiracy theories dreamt up by people who want to damage China, and you shouldn't repeat them because it's irresponsible of you to do so. Within a matter of months, that stance had kind of completely flipped and become the camps in Xinjiang are, an excellent policy from which the world should learn. We welcome foreigners to travel and see how the policy works in practice. So kind of going from flat out denial to uncritical praise. And I don't think that at any point in that process, the diplomats who were charged with making those statements had any input on what was actually going on in Beijing. They were just kind of responding to very powerful officials in Xinjiang and in the Chinese capital who were making those policies. And so it becomes incredibly difficult to kind of separate out fact from propaganda in that approach. And I think that's one of the things that's become really tricky for multinational companies. I think it's important, to kind of just for multinationals to stay connected to the government in Washington and stay on top of the latest reporting that they're doing. Try to balance that out by looking at what NGOs are saying, kind of compare that to the Chinese government's line, and try to reach your own best assessment of what's going on and what's most appropriate for the company. But it's certainly an area where, as I said, distinguishing rhetoric from reality is extremely tough.
So I see one question from Jonathan in the chat, and before I get to him, I just wanted to kind of build off of something you mentioned, switching gears to your experience as a journalist in China, which I'm sure helped inform this book a great deal. But in the book, one of the examples that I found really fascinating was of Edgar Snow, a journalist who was sympathetic to the communist cause, and China really kind of used him, it sounded like from the book, to help shape international public opinion about China in somewhat a successful way. So I was just curious, in your experience covering China as a journalist, did you see that really those tendencies that you noted with the historical case of Edgar Snow of sort of calculated flattery and that calculated stage management towards journalists and to some degree other diplomats visiting diplomats, is that really still the case, or is that more of a historical artifact?
Yeah, I mean, there's always been this this tension in the way that China deals with foreign journalists, right? On the one hand, it's very suspicious of their activities and wants to be critical and kind of engage on that level. And on the other hand, it a little bit like diplomacy itself, it needs that engagement and it needs those bridges to the outside world. So there's been this approach which China has used, which it refers to as friendship diplomacy. And Edgar Snow fits kind of firmly in that model. And the idea is that some individuals who Beijing believes might be amenable to spreading its view will be given special access in return for not necessarily reporting falsehoods, but neglecting to report on some things and making sure that the government's view is amply represented. And so Edgar Snow was one of those individuals. He was an American journalist in the 1930s who managed to secure an interview with Mao and did a great deal to help the communists improve their international image. But his writings were also edited personally by Mao and shaped by the Communist Party very strongly. And actually, it's really interesting if you look at statements coming out of Beijing. They talk about the need to develop a new generation of Edgar Snows, and when they feel like someone is amenable to presenting their message, they will respond with that same kind of flattery and access that we saw with Snow in the 1930s. I think the problem is for them that most major media outlets kind of are not comfortable with taking that approach, and therefore the flattery doesn't get them very far.
Great. So Jonathan Roll, I'll toss it over to you if you want to come off mute and ask your question.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thanks for being with us, Mr. Martin. My name is Jonathan. I'm a science and tech policy student at ASU. I kind of focus on stuff in the BRI and the Belt and Road Initiative. But my question was a little bit more about maybe the public opinion that is, within the country. This is a giant population. And, if we were kind of looking at the US here, there's what you call an Overton window, where leadership has sort of a range of ways that they can approach the world and approach policies, given the sort of the palatability of the actual public. So I didn't know if maybe the public in China, there's some sort of read that there's a disconnect between the leadership, or if they are sort of lockstep with sort of the tone and the tenor of wolf warrior diplomacy in this more aggressive place that China has in the world. And the last two examples I'd give that are sort of touchstones we know about recently is just, you have a lot of really rich billionaires that might not represent the public in China, but that are certainly being cracked down on now from leadership. But then there's also this sort of middle income trap. I wonder if there's a big chunk of the population, young people that are hopeful, that are going, I don't really know if this is the way that I want my country to go. So I just didn't know if you could speak to that a little bit more. Is it sort of this Faustian bargain that they've been trapped into, or are they lockstep with the leadership in general? Or Chinese folks also feeling this way about the outside world?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, it's obviously a very sophisticated question, and the answer is also, I think, it's kind of difficult to simplify too much. And as you know, it's a nation of 1.4 billion people, and so any statement about China sort of having one homogenous opinion is very tricky. I think we can sort of cautiously say that the tougher approach to diplomacy has pretty broad support inside China. Certainly, when Chinese diplomats are seen standing up to their US counterparts in meetings, dressing them down through lengthy speeches, these kinds of things, those moments will go viral on the Chinese internet. And there have even been sort of merchandise sold of some of the moments and phrases which have summed up that new approach. And so I think, especially when it comes to the US, there is pretty broad support. But it's so difficult to kind of nail down exactly how deep-seated that is, and whether there are any fragilities there, because the government is so sensitive about its control over information. And I think what's also true is that Chinese citizens want they don't want to come from a pariah state, and they don't want to come from a government which is not respected around the world. And if you read comments on Wolf Warrior diplomacy, you do get the sense, kind of around the fringes and in quieter moments, that there are misgivings as well, and that some people wish that that there could be a bit more of a constructive approach and a bit more meaningful dialogue. But I think that over the last few years in particular, the US's stance has been so strong on those issues that it's been very easy for the Chinese government to kind of vilify the US and say everything is America's fault and the US is too aggressive. And so that's kind of given the government a bit of an open door. But I would kind of always say with public opinion, watch this space and don't be too quick to simplify.
Thank you.
Thanks. So I'll turn it over to Robert Robinson, who had a question about China's recent anti-consumer behavior in the chat. So Robert, if you want to come off mute.
Okay. Yeah, I'm no student of China, so I could be reading signals all wrong, and I'm sure your reading will be better. But it seems to me that the recent power outages that have been sweeping through China, some of which appear to me to be artificially produced, some of the jam ups at ports, some of the transportation problems, they seem to me to be signals to their society that they want to back off some from the heavy reliance on consumer goods production and swing those industries more toward high-tech, artificial intelligence, and so on. And maybe also to stick it to us, who are totally dependent on their consumer goods production. Am I anywhere near correct on this? Are you reading similar?
I guess I'm no expert on the Chinese energy sector or the Chinese economy, but I would tend to kind of gut check that a little bit, in the same way you might do if someone were looking at the United States. I think a lot of the time in China, people look at the US and they'll kind of see this tycoon in this state saying this thing, and someone in Washington saying another thing, and the Washington Post is saying one more thing, and they assume that all of these things are carefully triangulated and working together. And in fact, when we look at our own societies, we know that it's usually not that way at all, and you don't want to see too much pattern in the chaos, or assume that there's signal when in fact what you're hearing is just a bunch of noise. And I think the same thing applies to China. I wouldn't tend to think that those things were working in quite the pattern that you laid out, but you know, again, I'm no expert, but you know, what is clear is that China has incredibly well set long-term ambitions to upgrade its industry and to move away from lower end manufacturing. You know, those ambitions have been there since the 1980s, and they were developed in the 90s, the 2000s, and then you know, Xi Jinping has this plan for Made in China 2025, which caused great worry and concern in the Trump administration. So I think this, you know, the broader idea that China has a concerted plan and is working towards it is absolutely accurate.
So it's hard to believe, but we're coming up on the hour already. So this may be our last question. Richard Wildung, I see you have your hand raised if you want to chime in with the question.
Peter, if I were to project China is the world leader in the 2050s and 2060s, similar to the way the US led the world in the 1950s and 60s, would I be crazy, or would it be a reasonably good prediction?
I don't think you could possibly pick a more appropriate final question. That kind of that wraps it all into one. You know, in truth, I don't know the answer to that question. I think that's one of the things that makes it so exciting to kind of be a student of Chinese politics and diplomacy and try to figure out how these things will play out long term. China's leader Xi Jinping is very clear about what the answer is. He said that by 2049, China will be, you know, a leading power. Anyone's equal militarily, economically. There are people in the Biden administration. One of the directors for China, Rush Doshi, who has written a book about how Beijing aims to supplant the United States' global leadership. But you know, I think that what strikes people who have watched, you know, many people who have watched China for a long time, is also the weaknesses that go hand in hand with China's kind of pursuit of global power. It has an aging population. The country will, you know, will struggle to produce the same kind of workforce it's had in the past, going into future decades. It has an economic model which many people feel is kind of running out of steam, and there's an open question about whether it will be able to upgrade quickly enough to kind of see off those problems. There's also an extraordinary weight of expectation from the Chinese public, whether it comes to an issue like retaking Taiwan, or standing up to the United States, which leads you know, some of China's political elites to feel hemmed in at times, and there are problems, you know, finally of Beijing's own making. You know, we've talked a lot today about wolf warrior diplomacy and the backlash against China's international tactics, and I think that a lot of people also feel like China is creating obstacles to its own rise with a lot of those approaches. And so, you know, I don't know how things will shake out in the long term, but it's easy for me to see why many you know, urge caution in assuming that China will achieve all of those objectives.
Great, thank you. That was an excellent sort of wrap-up question.
Yeah.
So before I turn it back over to Kristen for just the announcing of who won the signed book copy, I would just encourage everyone who doesn't win the signed copy to go out and get yourself one, because it was a really fantastic read. Even if you're not a China expert, if you like history, if you like diplomacy and want to learn more about China, really excellent read. So thank you, Peter, so much for joining us today. It was a really great conversation. I definitely learned a lot, so I appreciate your time. Before I turn it over to Kristen, did you have any sort of final words you wanted to say in closing?
No, I'd just like to thank everyone so much for hosting me today. It was a real pleasure, and the quality of the conversation I thought was really high. So thank you, all of you, for your input.
Thanks, Peter. Kristen, over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. Really, it was such a pleasure to have you today. We really appreciate your time traveling virtually across the country to be with us today here in Arizona. We're very, very thrilled we were able to hear from you. And as Nicole said, the book is excellent. For myself, someone this is not my region of the world area of expertise, and it has just been such an interesting and fascinating read. So again, I also encourage those whoever does not win the book to get your own copy. It truly is very informative, extremely well written, very well done. So congratulations on your book, Peter. Nicole, thank you so much for your leadership today. You did an amazing job moderating. Couldn't have had a better moderator for this event, so appreciate you very much. Also, thanks so much to the attendees. We really appreciate you being here today. I hope you'll join us for more of our upcoming events, which I'm just going to share some of those in just a moment. But that said, we are giving away a signed copy of Peter's book. I am going to kind of ask our program coordinator here at Global Ties Arizona, Sonal Lal, to kind of assist me in making sure we can do this in a fair way. So I am going to be randomly generating a number between the number of participants that were on the line today. I know we were at about 31. I know some folks have probably had to drop off the line, so we are going to include them on the list as well. So that said, my random number generator is showing me 16. Sonal, I wonder if you could tell us who the 16th person is on your list.
Definitely. The 16th person I have here is Mr. Kevin Hernandez.
Very nice. Kevin, congratulations. There he is. I do see him still on the line. So congratulations, Kevin, one of our question askers this afternoon. We will reach out to you via email so that we can get your information on where to ship your book. But that said, I would also like to encourage everyone to please join us for some of our other upcoming events as part of our Asia Forum. Just going to share my screen real quick here. We do have coming up next week our Chinatown Hall, which is going to be offered in a hybrid format. It will be at ASU Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law in the WP Carey Foundation Armstrong Great Hall downtown, and that will also be offered in a hybrid format in a virtual format, I'm sorry. On the 23rd, on Saturday 23rd, we are going to be having a cultural discussion over lunch at George Yang's restaurant in Central Phoenix. That's going to be $25 per person. We do have some student passes available. So if you are a student and you would like to join us, we would be happy to waive that admission price for you. So please reach out to me. I'm going to put my email in the chat. And then finally on the 28th, we are going to have our monthly destination series, this time featuring Vietnam. So that said, I hope that you will stay tuned for all the things that are upcoming. Join us, please reach out with any questions. And then the final thing that I also have is we have a quick survey that Sonal, if you could drop that into, I think it's a Google form. If you could just fill out that quick, I think it's 3 questions, just to like literally 10 seconds. Let us know how you liked your experience today with us in this program. We'd love to get your feedback. So again, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate your your participation, your attendance, and Peter, thank you again so much for being with us today at Global Ties Arizona.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Everyone have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.